The animal control truck rolled through the gate at 7 sharp, and the blind lioness stood between it and a small brown and white dog, like she could see every inch of the road. Kira's ears were back, her tail rigid. Stephanie Burns ran up with a folder pressed to her chest, breath tight. She had used every hour of the 48 they gave her, and she still couldn't explain how a dog no one had noticed had kept a blind lioness alive. Before we go on, comment down below where in the world you're listening from, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one. The officer in the truck was a heavy-set man with kind eyes and tired shoulders, and he did not want to be there. He rolled the window down and cleared his throat. "Ms. Burns, you got that paperwork or not?" Stephanie couldn't answer at first. Her mouth was dry, her fingers stiff around the folder. Behind her, the small dog. Bo sat down slowly, like his legs hurt him now, and pressed the side of his head against Kira's front leg. Kira did not move. She just breathed the slow, heavy breath she always breathed when she wanted him close. Everything in Stephanie's life for the last month had come down to this: a folder, a signature, a dog that had spent a year and a half doing something no one at Sunridge had bothered to see. She held out the folder, and because her hand was still shaking, she said, "You need to look at this before you touch him." The truth was, Stephanie had almost turned the sanctuary down. She was 31 years old. Halfway through a research grant she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, and Sunridge Big Cat Sanctuary sat 2 hours west of Austin, tucked into the rolling limestone hills outside Kerrville, Texas. Her department wanted her to study spatial cognition in injured big cats, how a lion or a tiger built a mental map of its enclosure once its senses were compromised. Everyone told her Sunridge had the perfect subject. Kira, a 12-year-old lioness, completely blind for 2 years after a corneal infection took both eyes, who still walked the same quarter-mile path every morning from her sleeping shelter to the main watering hole, over sun-baked caliche, loose rock and cedar roots, without so much as pausing at the drop-offs. The staff called it muscle memory. Her academic advisor called it a career-making paper. Stephanie called it a long drive and a hot summer, and she almost said no. She said yes because of one line in the sanctuary's response letter. It was written by the executive director, a wiry man in his 60s named Dale Ramsey, and it said, "We can't tell you why she still walks. We just know she does. We'd like it if somebody could." That kind of honesty was rare in her field. She packed her thermal camera rig, 3 memory cards, 4 changes of clothes, and drove out on a Sunday afternoon in late June when the highway shimmered in the heat like water on a hot pan. Kerrville smelled like cedar and warm asphalt. The sanctuary road went another 12 miles past town, past a stretch of ranches with cattle standing motionless under mesquite trees, past a rusted trailer with a hand-painted sign that said, "Fresh honey, knock loud." She turned in at a wooden arch that read, "Sunridge," and drove down a caliche drive that made her tires sound like they were rolling over dry cereal. When she stopped in front of the office, a small building of white siding and green trim with a screen door that banged in the wind, a man came out to meet her. Dale Ramsey was thin and sunburned across the bridge of his nose. He wore a straw hat, jeans that had been washed 1,000 times, and a T-shirt with the sanctuary logo faded almost to nothing. He shook her hand hard, in the way of men who don't know their own strength, and said, "Bob would have liked you. He always said scientists show up in the wrong shoes." Stephanie looked down at her hiking boots and laughed for the first time in a week. "Bob?" she asked. "Bob Wilkins," Dale said. "Founded this place. He died 2 years ago, about the same time Kira went blind. Feels wrong that he isn't here to meet you. He was the one who wrote back to the university, back before he got sick. He said we needed somebody who could tell us what we were looking at. Then he passed, and nobody had the heart to follow up till this year." He looked away when he said it, and Stephanie understood without asking that Bob Wilkins had been the kind of man whose absence changed the air of a place. Dale walked her out to the main enclosures that first evening. There were 3 tigers rescued from a defunct roadside zoo in Oklahoma, 2 black leopards from a private collector in Louisiana who lost his license, a cougar named June who had lived her whole life in a cage the size of a bathroom and was still learning to walk on grass. And at the far end of the property, past a windbreak of tall junipers, Kira. She was lying on her side under a slab of shade cast by an old wooden lean-to, and her breathing was slow and even, and her closed eyelids were sunken over the empty sockets like folded paper. Stephanie had seen photographs. Photographs did not prepare her. There was still muscle across the lioness's shoulders. Her paws were huge and calm. She had a small notch missing from her right ear, and her flanks rose and fell with the kind of dignity you can't buy or fake. "Every morning at first light," Dale said. "She walks from that shelter to the watering hole and back. Same path, never wanders. We keep it clear. We watch. But most days we don't have to." Stephanie asked how it worked. Dale opened his mouth to answer and then closed it again. "I've been asking that myself for 2 years," he said. "I stopped trying to explain it. I just tried to be grateful." That first night, Stephanie set up her thermal camera rig along the length of the path in 3 positions, low and hidden under mesquite branches. She used narrow-angle infrared lenses that read heat instead of light, so she could film in total dark without spooking the animal. She was in bed by 10 in the guest house behind the office, listening to the crickets and one distant coyote and the fan clicking over her bed, thinking about her advisor and her grant renewal and whether she had chosen the right subject. She did not fall asleep for a long time. At 4 in the morning, she was already back on the ridge above the enclosure, coffee in a thermos, notebook open on her knee. She watched the first pale line of light climb along the eastern hills. She watched a jackrabbit cross the path. She watched Kira walk out of her shelter, sniff the wind, and start down the Kalisha toward the water. It was exactly what Dale had described. The lioness moved without hesitation. She avoided the biggest root at the second bend by dipping her head. She sidestepped a loose stone near the third bend as if she had seen it 100 times before. She reached the water, drank, and turned around. 22 minutes there and back, according to Stephanie's watch. When Kira was back in the shade of her shelter, Stephanie packed up the cameras and went to review the footage in the office. Dale had left her a plate of homemade banana bread on the desk and a note that said, "Milk in fridge. Don't touch the mug with the tiger on it. It's Marcy's, and she's meaner than any of the cats." Stephanie ate 2 slices and started the review. On the visible light camera she had also mounted, everything looked as described. Kira walked. Kira drank. Kira walked back. Then she opened the thermal file, and for a long moment she thought her card was corrupted. Because there were not one warm shape on the path, there were 2. A big one, Kira, glowing coral pink against the cool blue of the ground, and beside her, just below her shoulder, a small warm smear about the size of a knee-high dog. It walked in perfect step. When Kira slowed, it slowed. When Kira reached the bend where the root was, it pressed briefly against her flank, and the lioness dipped her head at the exact moment before her paw met the root. Stephanie leaned closer to the screen. Her coffee went cold in her hand. She rewound the footage and watched it again, then again. The small, warm shape was there for the whole walk. 22 minutes. Not once did it leave the lioness's side. She almost missed dinner that night because she was still at the screen. She almost missed breakfast the next morning because she went out at 3:30 to set the cameras earlier. She wanted to see it approach. She wanted to see how the 2 of them met each morning. And what she filmed and later reviewed with her hands trembling slightly on the mouse was this. The small, warm shape crossed the yard from the direction of the office. It came at a slow, unhurried walk. It stopped just outside Kira's shelter, sat down, and waited. When Kira stirred and stood, the shape stood too. When Kira stepped out into the greying dawn, the shape was already at her shoulder, as if it had been coming to work every morning for a very long time. At breakfast, she asked Dale, "Whose dog is that little brown and white one?" Dale, chewing scrambled eggs, said without looking up, "That's Bo. He belongs to somebody on staff." "He belongs to himself now," Dale said. "He was Bob's. Bob picked him up out on the road one afternoon. About 8 years ago. Left ear had been chewed by something. Bob brought him home, patched him up, said, 'This one's a keeper.' They were together right up till the day Bob died. Then Bo just kind of stayed. Sleeps on the porch of the office most nights. Eats what Marcy leaves in a bowl. Nobody's really claimed him, and he hasn't asked to be claimed." He paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "Why?" "He walks with Kira," Stephanie said. "Every morning. He walks the whole path with her." Dale set the fork down. "Well," he said after a while, "that would explain a couple of things, wouldn't it?" Marcy Whitfield had been at Sunridge for 11 years. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her late 50s, with steel-grey hair pulled back tight and a pair of reading glasses on a beaded cord around her neck. She managed the front office, the volunteers, and, according to Dale, just about anything else we're too tired to argue about. When Stephanie showed her the thermal footage, Marcy watched in silence. And then she took her glasses off and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "I saw him walking with her once," Marcy said quietly. "About a year ago. I thought I was making it up. I thought, well, he'd been Bob's dog, and he was probably just wandering. I didn't know he was doing that every day. Nobody looked." Stephanie asked if she could pull the sanctuary's old security footage. Sunridge had cameras at the office, at the front gate, and at the corner of Kira's enclosure. Cheap, low resolution, but they saved to a hard drive that went back 3 years. Marcy said she could, and by that afternoon they were both in the office with the fan on and the blinds drawn, scrolling through 18 months, then 20, then 24. They watched Kira's night patrols, the fence checks, the deer at dawn. And then, on a date exactly 6 days after Bob Wilkins died, a date circled in Marcy's calendar with a plain black pen, they saw the first meeting. The lioness had lost her sight the previous winter. Bob had died in the spring, and on this particular morning, at just after 5 in the morning, Kira was standing in her enclosure by the fence post nearest the office, and she was circling, slow, confused circles, sightless, head low. She had done this every morning for 6 days, and every morning the staff had watched with clipboards and pity, and no one had known what to do beyond stand there and worry. Then Bo came out of the office. He crossed the yard at a slow walk. He did not run. He did not bark. He walked straight to the fence, ducked under the lowest strand at a spot only a small dog knew about, and stopped just inside the enclosure, in front of Kira. Marcy pressed her hand to her mouth. The lioness stopped circling. She lifted her head. She sniffed the air. And Bo, small, scruffy, 40 pounds of dust and sunlight, simply stood there. He did not touch her. He did not move. He stood in front of her, in the exact place where the path to the watering hole began, and he waited. For nearly a full minute, the two animals were still together. Then Kira lowered her head. She took one careful step forward. Bo moved with her, and together they walked that first morning down the path. Stephanie played the clip 3 times. When she looked up, Marcy was crying without making any sound. "That was 6 days after we buried him," Marcy said. 6 days. Stephanie asked what she meant. Marcy said, "I mean 6 days after he was gone. That dog woke up and went to work. Somebody had to." Stephanie did not sleep that night either. She spent the rest of that first week filming, cross-referencing footage, and writing furious notes in a journal that had originally been meant for measurements. Every morning Bo walked with Kira. Every morning she moved with confidence. Every evening, if the walk was later than usual, sometimes when a summer thunderstorm rolled in and the shadows shifted, Bo was there again, pressing against her flank at the bend, cutting slowly in front of her when the ground dropped without warning, leading her back to the shelter before the rain hit. He didn't do this in front of anyone. He didn't do it for treats. Marcy left a bowl of dry food on the office porch, and Bo ate it when he was hungry, and nobody had ever seen him beg. He worked because the work was there, and then he slept on the porch until the work came again. Stephanie's research changed shape in her hands. What had started as a paper on spatial cognition became something else entirely, a documented case of interspecies cooperation in a captive setting, initiated by the animal itself, unrewarded and unbroken across 18 months. She began to draft an outline. She emailed her advisor. She stayed up late one Thursday night in the second week and wrote on the back of an envelope the sentence, "The lioness did not learn her path. The dog carries her along it." Then, 3 weeks after she arrived, the board sent notice. It came on a Monday morning, and Dale walked into the office holding a printed email in his hand and a look on his face, like he had eaten something wrong. "You need to read this," he said. Stephanie read it, standing up. It was signed by 4 of the 7 board members, the 4 that mattered, and it opened with the usual condolences on the passing of their friend and founder, and it went straight from there to the point. In light of the recent research documentation, and given the sanctuary's licensing obligations under the state's captive animal statute, the board was formally required to address the presence of an unregistered domestic animal within the enclosures of protected exotic wildlife. Bo, they wrote, was not vaccinated on any documented record. He was not licensed. He was not covered by the sanctuary's liability insurance. He posed, in the wording of the email, an unacceptable risk. She had 48 hours to produce documentation, or the board would call animal control to remove the dog and presumably place him in the shelter system. She read it twice, then she read it a third time. "This is because of my footage," she said. Dale nodded slowly, not looking at her. "It is. They saw a small dog inside an exotic animal enclosure, and they saw insurance dollars." "That's exactly right. But he isn't harming anything. He's what makes it work." "I know." Dale ran his thumb along the brim of his hat. "But the board isn't just Marcy and me. The board is Kevin Frost and Linda Chase and Tom Hollis and Dr. Patterson, and Kevin Frost has been trying to shut this place down for 4 years so he can buy the land and put a rifle lodge on it." He looked up at her finally. "This is his way in." Stephanie sat down. She looked at her hands. She was not the kind of person who cried in front of strangers. She had made a small career out of not crying in front of strangers. But she felt something hot press behind her eyes, and she said very quietly, "So what do I do?" Dale sat on the edge of the desk. "You've got 2 days, he said. "You can walk into the board meeting on Wednesday morning with paperwork that registers Bo as something they can't touch, or you can watch a dog go into the shelter system and a lioness lose her sight all over again." He paused. "I don't know how that paperwork exists, but I know Bob would have found a way." She spent the rest of that day at the desk, drinking coffee that had gone cold, going through every state and federal registration category for working animals: service dog, emotional support, livestock guardian, research assistant. Each one had rules that ruled Bo out. He was not trained by an accredited program. He was not owned by a registered handler. He was not a certified anything. But there was one category, obscure, mostly used by university biology departments, that let a credentialed researcher register a specific animal as a working animal under her own study for the duration of her grant. She read that section 3 times. She read the fine print. She read the exclusions. Bo qualified barely if she added him to her research protocol and if the sanctuary's board approved him as a participant. Approval had to be in writing. Signed. Filed with the state within 72 hours. She could file the paperwork herself, but she could not force the board to sign it. That night, the night before the board meeting, she couldn't sleep. She wandered through the office at midnight, looking for anything of Bob's she hadn't already seen. Dale had told her once, casually, that Bob's old files were still in a metal cabinet in the back room, in case anybody ever wanted to know what a real man's handwriting looked like. She opened the cabinet. It smelled like paper and pipe tobacco. Inside were folders labeled in careful block letters: donors, medical, grant applications, personal. She pulled out personal. Inside were sympathy cards, a photograph of Bob shaking hands with a former governor at a benefit dinner, a folded veterinary invoice with Bo's name on it from 8 years earlier for antibiotics and stitches to a chewed left ear, and a single small memory card in a plastic case on which someone, probably Bob, had written in blue ink, "Do not lose." She took the card back to her laptop. On it there was one file, a video about 4 minutes long. Bob Wilkins, sitting in this same office at this same desk, wearing the same straw hat that was still hanging on the coat rack behind her. His face was thinner than in the photographs. The lighting was low. He was speaking to the camera the way tired men speak, like the words were being pulled up out of something deep. "This is our 5th year," he was saying. "Our accountant said we won't finish this one. He's a good accountant. He's usually right." Bob rubbed the back of his neck. "But if this is the last year, I want somebody to know why we bothered. There are places out there for the animals people wave to. Zoos with the lights, aquariums with the glass tunnels. That's a whole industry." "That's fine, that's not us." He leaned forward. "Our only job out here is to see the ones other people walk past." He looked straight into the camera. "You walk past enough of them, and pretty soon you can't see anything anymore, because you've trained your eyes wrong. Bob Wilkins, out at Sunridge, 2nd of November, just in case." The file ended. Stephanie sat still for a long time. Outside, a screech owl made a soft, whistling call. She heard Bo's toenails click faintly on the porch boards as he adjusted his sleeping position. She played the video again. Then she did something she would later think of as the smallest and most important decision of her professional life. She copied the file onto her phone. She printed the paperwork she had filled out that afternoon. She wrote a cover memo to the board, single-spaced, 1 page long. She did not sleep at all. The board meeting was at 9 on Wednesday morning in the small conference room off the office. 7 chairs around a table, Marcy on one side, notebook open, Dale at the head, Kevin Frost, the man who wanted the land, in a starched shirt and boots he had never used to work, Linda Chase, who liked Kevin and didn't like anyone else, Tom Hollis, who ran an insurance agency in Kerrville and always spoke as if the room were about to be sued, Dr. Patterson, the sanctuary's veterinarian, who had been Bob's friend for 24 years, and a 7th chair, empty, that belonged to a board member out of state. Stephanie sat in a folding chair against the wall. She had spent an hour that morning trying to decide whether to wear a blouse or a t-shirt. She wore the blouse. Kevin Frost started by clearing his throat and saying, "Well, folks, I think this one's straightforward. State says we can't have an unlicensed animal in a protected enclosure. Ms. Burns's own research documents the presence, so we're going to have to move on it." He smiled, thin and tight. "Anyone want to make the motion?" Dale glanced at Stephanie. Stephanie stood. "Before you take the motion," she said, "I'd like to show you something." Kevin exhaled through his nose. "Ms. Burns, with respect, this isn't a research meeting." "It'll take 4 minutes," she said. She was not asking. She was already opening her laptop and turning it toward the table. She pressed play. Bob Wilkins came up on the screen in the same straw hat that hung 6 feet behind Kevin Frost's head. The room went very still. Even Kevin was quiet. Bob spoke about the 5th year and the accountant. He spoke about the industries and the tunnels. And when he leaned forward and said, "Our only job out here is to see the ones other people walk past," Marcy pressed her hand flat against her mouth. When the file ended, Stephanie shut the laptop softly. Nobody spoke for a while. Then she said, "I've submitted paperwork to register Bo as a working animal under my research credentials. The state accepts that filing if this board approves it in writing before the end of business today. He would be vaccinated, licensed, insured, and covered under the university's liability policy. He would not cost this sanctuary a single dollar. He would remain here with Kira for the duration of my grant." She looked at each of them. 3 days ago, I was ready to write a paper about a lioness who walks a path by memory. That paper would have been in a journal that fewer than 400 people read, but this morning I have footage that will be shared across the country. The story of Sunridge is going to be told either way. The only choice this board makes today is which story. Kevin Frost stared at his hands. Linda Chase stared at Kevin Frost. Tom Hollis stared at the insurance clause on the front of his own copy of the meeting packet. Dr. Patterson looked at Bob's straw hat on the coat rack. It was quiet for what Stephanie later, in her notes, described as 11 minutes of the longest silence I have ever sat inside. Then Dr. Patterson said, "I'll second whatever motion approves it." Marcy said, "Motion to approve Bo's registration as filed by Ms. Burns." Dale said, "All in favor." 6 hands went up. Kevin Frost's did not. The motion passed 6-1. Bo stayed. Stephanie walked out of the meeting and sat on the office porch and put her head in her hands, and after a moment Bo came around the corner and sat down beside her without touching her, in the way he always sat beside things that needed to be still. She reached down and put her palm flat on the warm fur between his shoulders. It was the first time she had touched him. He allowed it for about 10 seconds, then stood up and walked away to check on Kira. The animal control officer came anyway 2 mornings later because Kevin Frost had called him before the vote and had not called him back to cancel. That was the morning of the truck at the gate, and the folder pressed to Stephanie's chest, and the officer saying, "Ms. Burns, you got that paperwork or not?" She held out the folder. The officer read it, front to back, and then he set his hat on the seat beside him and said, "Ma'am, I've been driving out to this sanctuary for 20 years, and I've picked up a lot of things I didn't want to pick up." He nodded toward Bo, who was still leaning against Kira's leg. "I ain't picking that up today." He tipped his hat, turned the truck around in the dust, and drove back down the caliche the way he had come. Stephanie stood there in the dirt for a long time, and Kira turned her blind face slowly toward her, and Bo sat down at the edge of the path, and the day went on. She thought that was the end of it. It was not. 3 days later, a package arrived at the office with no return address. Inside was a copy of a plat map of the sanctuary and the surrounding parcels, with red lines drawn along the fences and a printed asking price at the bottom. The price was aggressive. Underneath it, someone, presumably Kevin Frost, had written in ballpoint pen, "Your 5 biggest donors were sent this same map yesterday. Consider your position." Dale read the letter. He read it twice. Then he sat down heavily and said, "He's trying to make them pull out." He looked exhausted, in the way that people look when they finally see a fight they have suspected for years. "If Kevin gets 3 of those 5 to leave, we don't finish the year. Doesn't matter how many dogs we register." Stephanie asked what the sanctuary's operating budget was for the year. Dale told her. It was a small number in the world of what it did. It was a very large number in the world of what could be raised in a hurry. And they had, at most, 3 months. That night, Stephanie sat on the porch until well after midnight, watching the summer lightning far off over the hills, listening to Bo's slow breathing beside her. She thought about her paper. She thought about the 12 seconds of thermal footage she had, the shot where Bo pressed his side against Kira at the edge of the drop. She had planned to bury that clip in the middle of a 50-page research article that no one outside her field would ever open. She thought about Bob Wilkins saying, "Our only job out here is to see the ones other people walk past." She thought about the number Dale had told her. Then she went back inside and opened her laptop and started to write. Not a paper this time, but a short piece, plain language, 1 page long, about a lioness who could no longer see and a small dog who had, on his own, gone to work. She attached the 12 seconds of footage. She sent it to the science communications office at her university. And underneath, in the body of the email, she wrote a single line to the woman who ran the office. Please share this before Friday. It matters. The clip went up on the university's social pages on a Thursday afternoon with a short caption and the sanctuary's donation link. By Friday morning, it had been shared 18,000 times. By Saturday, more than 140,000. By Sunday night, when Stephanie finally checked her phone after 2 days of thunderstorms and lost signal, she found 76 missed calls, 312 email messages, and a text from her advisor that said only, "Are you okay?" She was okay. Kira was okay. Bo was, according to Marcy, sleeping like a person on the porch, and if you touch him, I will bite you. The sanctuary's donation page had received, in the space of 3 days, more than the total operating budget Dale had told her they needed for the year. And that was before the news outlets called. Kevin Frost resigned from the board on Monday morning in an email whose only complete sentence was, "I no longer feel my interests are aligned with the sanctuary's direction." Linda Chase quietly withdrew her support for his proposal about the same time. Tom Hollis showed up at the office Tuesday with a covered casserole dish and did not mention the meeting. For a little while, Stephanie thought the fight was over. She was wrong. The fight was almost never the fight she thought it was. On the last Saturday in July, a woman she had never seen walked into the office. She was in her middle 30s, tall, with dark hair pulled into a low ponytail and a small bag over one shoulder. She stood in the doorway a long time before she spoke. "Is Marcy here?" she asked. Marcy was in the back room going through invoices. She came out drying her hands on a paper towel, and when she saw the woman, she stopped in the middle of the floor and let out a long, tired breath. "Molly," she said. "Molly," the woman said. "I saw the videos." Marcy looked at Stephanie, and Stephanie did not know what to do with her face, so she looked at the woman, and the woman said, "I'm Bob's daughter." Molly Wilkins sat at the desk with a mug of tea between her hands. Marcy sat across from her. Dale stood in the doorway. Stephanie sat off to the side with her notebook closed on her knee. "I haven't been out here since the funeral," Molly said. I know that's a long time. My mother and dad, well..." She waved her hand as if the sentence would finish itself. "There's a lot in that. But I saw the clip. I saw the dog. And I need to tell you something, because you all deserve to know it." She took a breath. "The dog is the reason Dad started this place." Marcy closed her eyes for a moment. Dale did not move. Stephanie's pen stayed still against her notebook. 20 years ago, Molly said, Dad worked in the oil business. He wasn't happy. He drank too much. He wasn't a bad man, but he was, honestly, a small one. I was 12, 13 years old. One evening he was driving home in the rain on a back road out past Fredericksburg, and he saw a shape on the shoulder that he thought was a piece of tire tread. He almost drove past it. He said later he almost did. Something made him stop. He got out and it was a dog, an older mixed breed hit by something and left there, still breathing. Dad wrapped it in his coat and drove it to the emergency vet in Kerrville. They said it was too far gone. He held it while it died, and it took about 40 minutes. Molly's voice was steady. 2 things happened. 1, he stopped drinking that night, which he did not tell anyone for months. And 2, he came home and told my mother he was going to spend the rest of his life on the ones that got walked past. She looked at Marcy. He never told me the dog's name because he didn't know it. But the reason he brought Bo home 8 years ago, the reason he stopped his truck for a scraggly stray with a chewed ear, was because he'd made a promise a long time before that he would always be the one who stopped. Marcy was quiet. "The reason I'm here," Molly said, and finally her voice caught, "is because I wanted you to know that when Bo chose to look after Kira, he was finishing something my father started on a road in the rain 20 years ago. And I wanted you to know that whatever happens with this place from here on, I'll help. My father left me a little bit of money that I never touched. It's not enough to run a sanctuary, but it's enough to keep the porch light on." She reached into her bag and took out a folded envelope. "It's yours." Marcy did not open it. She got up, walked around the desk, and put her arms around Molly's shoulders, and Molly leaned into her the way people do when they have been carrying something a long time. Stephanie stepped outside because it felt like the right thing to do. Bo was on the porch. He looked up at her. She sat down beside him, and this time he laid his chin across her boot and closed his eyes. That fall, the paper was published. It ran in a journal that had a small circulation, but the summary was picked up by 3 national outlets. A documentary team from Austin called about filming, and 2 universities called about collaboration. Stephanie extended her grant. She stayed on at Sunridge through the winter. She got to know Bo well enough to understand that he did not enjoy being petted for long stretches, but he tolerated it if you were reading a book, and he preferred you to talk to Kira, not to him. She got to know Kira well enough to recognize the small shift in the lioness's breathing that meant she wanted Bo closer, and the different one that meant she was satisfied and asleep. She got to know Dale and Marcy and Dr. Patterson well enough to trust them with almost anything. She thought that would be the story, but she had missed one more turn, and it came in the 2nd week of October. There had been a heavy rain the night before. The paths were slick in places, and Dale had gone out at first light to check the drainage along the low end of Kira's enclosure. He came back into the office pale under his sunburn. "Stephanie," he said. "Stephanie, you'd better come." She followed him at a run. Behind the shelter, at the point where the caliche path curved past a small rocky rise, Kira was standing still in the wet grass, not lying, standing. Her head was low. She was not moving forward. And Bo was on the ground in front of her, curled tight, chest heaving in shallow, quick breaths. There was a bright bead of blood on his front leg, and 1/2 foot away in the wet grass, Stephanie saw the shape of a coiled diamondback rattlesnake retreating slowly toward the rocks, its rattle silent now. Dale had already picked up a heavy stick from beside the trail and was standing between the snake and both animals, but the snake was leaving on its own. It slid back into the rocks and was gone. Bo did not move. Kira did not move. Dr. Patterson made it out from town in 34 minutes. He arrived with the satchel and the sanctuary's anti-venom kit, and he moved with the kind of speed people move with, only when they truly love a small thing. He worked on Bo under the shade of the shelter. Kira lay down slowly a few feet away, keeping her body pointed toward the sound of the little dog's breathing. Dr. Patterson worked for a long time. He did not talk. When he stopped, he wiped his forehead with his sleeve and said, "He got bit up high on the shoulder, not the leg. The blood on the leg is somebody else's." He looked at Dale. "Kira's got a scrape on her paw and a nick on the pad, but nothing worse. If that snake came at her from the low rocks and Bo put himself between them..." He stopped. He looked at the dog, who was blinking slowly and breathing more evenly now. "Well," he said. Then he did what he always does. Bo lay in the shade of the shelter for 2 days. Kira did not walk the path either of those mornings. She lay near him without touching him. On the 3rd morning, at first light, Bo got up on his feet, took a slow lap around the shelter, and came back to sit by Kira's shoulder. She stood. Together they walked, slower than usual but steady, from the shelter to the watering hole and back. Dale, watching from a distance, took his hat off and did not put it back on until they were both in the shade again. Stephanie thought that would be the last turn. It was not. The following spring, the sanctuary held its annual open day, the one Bob Wilkins had started 15 years earlier, and Marcy had run every year since. It usually drew a couple hundred locals with children and coolers. That year, it drew more than 3,000 people. The line of cars stretched a mile down the Caliche Road. A local news crew came out from San Antonio. Molly Wilkins came with 2 friends and stayed all afternoon, walking the grounds slowly. A young couple who had driven in from Amarillo 9 hours in a station wagon that clearly could not have made the trip easily, brought their 8-year-old daughter, who had lost most of her sight 2 years earlier, to the same kind of infection Kira had. The girl sat quietly at the edge of Kira's enclosure with her father's hand on her shoulder. When the little dog and the blind lioness walked past on their afternoon patrol, the girl said, very quietly, without looking at anyone, "She's not scared." Marcy heard her and had to walk away for a minute. But even that was not the moment Stephanie would remember for the rest of her life. That came at the very end of the day, when the last car had rolled out through the gate and the sun was setting on the western hills in the long, low, orange way that only Texas summers do. Dale was locking up the office. Marcy was carrying folding chairs back to the storage shed. Dr. Patterson was leaning on a fence rail with a cold soda. And Beau, who had been on the porch most of the day because the crowds bothered him, got up slowly on stiff old legs and walked out toward Kira's shelter. He did not walk fast. He was, Stephanie realized then, no longer a young dog. His muzzle had gone grey months ago. He had lost weight over the winter. Dr. Patterson had told her privately in February that Beau's heart was tired. He walked past the porch. He walked past the water trough. He walked all the way to Kira's shelter, and he lay down in the doorway, where the last band of sunlight fell across the dry ground. Kira came out. She stood over him for a moment. Then she lay down beside him, in the way she had lain beside him 100 mornings after the walk, and she pressed her side gently against his back, and she stayed there while the sun went the rest of the way down. Beau died 3 weeks later on a Tuesday in the middle of the afternoon, on the porch of the office, in his sleep. Marcy found him when she came out to sweep. She did not tell Stephanie right away. She walked all the way out to the shelter first and stood at the fence for a long time, and eventually Kira came out. The lioness did not walk to the waterhole that morning. Marcy sat down in the grass on her side of the fence and cried, and Kira lay down on her side of the fence, and neither of them moved until it was late in the afternoon and the shade had come around. Then Marcy went back to the office and called Stephanie in Austin. Stephanie was on the highway within 10 minutes. They buried Beau under the big oak beside Bob's grave. Molly Wilkins came out and stood beside Marcy. Dale said a few words. Dr. Patterson said a few more. Stephanie could not say anything for a while. When she could, she said, "He was the one who stopped." Everyone understood. For a long time afterward, Stephanie was afraid to go back and watch Kira walk the path. She was afraid the lioness would stand at her shelter door and not know how to go forward. She was afraid Kira would circle by the fence post the way she had before Beau, that first day 2 years earlier. But when Stephanie came out the following Saturday at first light and hid at the edge of the ridge with her cold coffee and her notebook, Kira walked. She walked slowly, and she paused at the second bend where the root was, and she dipped her head at the exact place she had always dipped her head, and she reached the watering hole, and she drank. She was not alone in her walking. There was Marcy on the path behind her, at a distance, watching. There was Dale near the shelter. There was Dr. Patterson up by the fence, arms folded. There was a young volunteer, a girl of 17 who had come out from Careville the week after Beau's death, and asked if she could help. There were 3 of the donors from Molly's contact list who had driven in from Houston overnight to sit on the porch of the office and drink coffee and be there, just to be there. The sanctuary had learned, in the space of 2 years, what Bo had known for 18 months. Kira was not walking by memory. She had never been walking by memory. She had been walking beside someone. And now, because someone had bothered to look, there were many someones. She was never alone on the path again. Stephanie sat in the office that night with a mug of tea and a photograph of Bo propped against the base of the desk lamp. She wrote a short piece, in plain language, 1 page long. She sent it this time without a research office in the middle. She sent it to her own website, and she sent it in an email to everyone who had ever donated to Sunridge. The subject line was 6 words. It said, "The dog came back to work." In the body of the email, she told them what had happened, and how, and why. She told them about Bob, and the rainy road, and the small dog with the chewed ear, and the 12 seconds of thermal footage that had traveled the world. She told them that Kira had walked that morning. She told them that when a little girl from Amarillo had asked why the lioness wasn't scared, the answer, whether the girl knew it or not, was that once you have been seen by somebody who bothered to stop, you are never entirely alone again. And then, because Bob Wilkins had told her, in a video she had watched at midnight in the back office of a sanctuary that had almost gone under, that their only job was to see the ones other people walked past. She wrote at the bottom of the email a small line that ran across the country in a matter of hours, and became, later, the motto that hung above the desk in the office at Sunridge, on a plain piece of paper Marcy had lettered by hand with a black pen. It was 6 words. Stop for the ones nobody sees. Underneath she added, if this story touched you, share it. Comment about a time in your own life when somebody stopped for you, and if you can, subscribe to us so we can keep telling stories like this one. She hit send. She turned off the desk lamp. She sat in the quiet of the office for a while. Outside, the porch was empty, but out beyond the junipers, in the dark of the sanctuary, the blind lioness was breathing evenly in her shelter, and somewhere overhead an owl called once, softly. Stephanie thought about the moment a small dog had crossed a yard on his own, 6 days after his person had died, because somebody had to. She thought about how a whole world could change if only enough people crossed the yard. She thought about the officer at the gate that first morning who had looked at the dog leaning against the lioness and said, "I ain't picking that up today." She thought about Molly Wilkins standing in the doorway saying, "I saw the videos." She thought about a girl in Amarillo whispering, "She's not scared." And she thought, sitting there in the dark of the office, with her hand flat on the desk where Bob Wilkins had once sat, that the work was going to be fine now, because there were many hands. She stood up. She locked the door. She walked out into the warm Texas night. Above her the stars were very bright. The path from the shelter to the watering hole was silvered by the moon. Somewhere in the dark, a small brown and white shape was not there, and would never be there again, and at the same time was everywhere along that path, in every footprint of the lioness who kept walking, in every set of eyes at the edge of the ridge, in every letter that arrived at Sunridge afterward from strangers who had been shown, in 12 seconds of footage, what it looked like to stay beside somebody. Kira lifted her head in her shelter, sniffed the wind, listened for a long moment and lay back down. She would walk again in the morning. She would not walk alone. If this story moved you, take a second to leave a comment about somebody who once stopped for you. Share it with a person who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Thank you for listening, and remember, the world gets a little kinder every time one of us bothers to stop for the ones nobody else sees.